Due to the graphic nature of this show, listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to Let's Talk About Killers, exclusive content and armchair analysis of the most dangerous people in America.
I'm Lance.
And I'm Dwayne.
And this is episode 3 of Let's Talk About Killers. Let's get back into Daniel Siebert. So I know that some people come here just with a bloodlust. So let's get into some of this other stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And there is definitely stuff I am not going to share. I mean, you just have no idea. I say this, but you have no idea how foul this guy is. Okay, so here's an example. He had a frequent fantasy about a man enslaving him and performing extreme sadomasochism and making him procure men, women, and children for the man to rape, torture, and kill. Wow. But, that's the fantasy this guy's having, and he thinks that's perfectly normal. And he thinks that things like that are based on, I've written pages on it, but I'm just going to paraphrase it. He believes, there's a conscious and subconscious mind, and there's a big void between.
Mm-hmm.
Now, first, this sounds like Freud's theory of the mind, where there's a subconscious, a preconscious, and a conscious mind. But this is different. He thinks that your conscious mind that is aware of itself, is rational, isn't prone to extreme acts of, violence.
Mm-hmm.
And then the subconscious is a place you can't even control. You don't even know you're there until it's too late. And it's responsible for all the murder and mayhem, as he puts it. And there's this big fog in between, a void, he calls it, that you have to, pass through. And he said the quickest way to move from your regular life in your conscience into your murdering subconscious is through the emotion of anger.
Mm-hmm.
Anger can put you right there, and then you're ready to do these things. But he says we've seen everybody get angry, and then, adrenaline starts pumping and you're shaking and you're not in control. But he is saying that it can become an addiction.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, he started at a very early age being molested and seeing crazy stuff, and then living on the street and being a, very young prostitute. And having basically a mentor that was grooming him to become a serial killer that, would have him over there wearing his mom's panties and having sex with him, all this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And he says that he just got accustomed to being there. And once you go there, it's impossible to come back. It's like, once you've tried heroin and it's amazing, and you just kind of, nothing else is going to make you feel that good again.
Mm-hmm.
And
it's almost like chasing the dragon.
That's right. Chasing the dragon. And he said that, there's a point where murder is just like, that's the best. But he's like, it isn't the very best,
mm-hmm.
which we'll learn more about in a minute. But yeah, he if you can combine extreme sex, basically, if you can combine sex and violence to the most extreme, combining sex with murdering someone, or, all this kind of stuff, that to him is the ultimate.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's, and he likes to, he says he lives in his subconscious in that dark place, and that it has just been attached to him for as long as he can remember. And that's just kind of where he was.
Mm-hmm.
I've written so many quotes of his. I was enveloped by the shadow of the dark that had become me. It's how he leads into explaining being in that part. He's a horrible, fascinating guy. Another thing that, and there's so much of this. Another thing is he refers to cycles, and he believes that, and I don't know, maybe he's right, but he believes that there are these cycles that you go through. There's a certain cycle related to puberty, or a certain cycle when your understanding of sex hits a certain point. a cycle where it's all these cycles of growth, of cycles of time, and how they affect someone.
Mm-hmm.
And those being interrupted or influenced by dark outside forces can put you where he's at, where you're just stuck in this place where you're just going to be. He has not apologized for any of his crimes. We'll get into what he says about what he would do different, and basically is kill more people. This is how he thinks it works. Also, later we're going to talk about how he has diagnosed, as I guess I mentioned it before, but we're going to talk about how he diagnosed other famous serial killers, and that is really, really wild.
Absolutely. And there's something that, going back to where you're thinking about how the crimes were committed, the first part that put me into the side that he really is thinking about how he's planned a crime, and when I thought about this is something that really was the most powerful, where he talks about when he went to the school to commit the murder, where else could you commit a crime where mostly, not everybody, because I guess could be over there at the apartment that can have, can hear everything, but he chose he was at the Deaf Institute, and he thought, well, what more perfect crime to commit than someone that can't hear anything or hear what's going on? So if he knew the neighbors that were around particularly were hearing impaired, I could commit this crime and nobody would hear anything. When I read about that's where he kind of started, his criminal activity as far as the murders were concerned. That's something that, kind of I thought about quite a bit, of how I think he particularly did that on purpose, thinking how can I get away with this? That's one more element that you would take out. Like a neighbor would say, well, I heard somebody screaming, down the hall. Well, of course, where he was, he wouldn't have to worry about that as much.
See, okay, yes, definitely. But he mentioned speaking to the prison psychologist who asked him if he could wake from this reality and go back, would he do it again? And his answer was absolutely. But he says this to you. And this is, by the way, a great example of how having a different kind of relationship with these killers allows us to tell a deeper story, because they wouldn't tell this stuff to, the authorities. But he said if he could do it again, and he could do it now, he would set up more private, secure killing environments. Then he would feast and feed on his victims and stalk men until he could find one that would control him and be his partner in murder. And he would leave more vivid and extreme scenes when he left. Now, that is just not the kind of daydreams that I had.
Mm-mm. And talking about everything being encapsulated all into one, like a best-selling novel.
I mean, it's like, and he just says it like no big deal. And then it's like, oh, well, how did you have, what did you have for breakfast today? Whatever.
Mm-hmm.
His fantasies are crazy. And he'll be talking about something and he'll say, I think a lot about killing men and boys, but women and girls are more exciting as murder victims for me.
Mm-hmm.
But I am growing more sexually attracted to young girls. He makes it clear that his past crimes, he definitely committed those murders. He feels that he had gratifying sex with many children. Take over for me.
Yeah. To me, it just pretty much encapsulates everything that the cliche, truth is stranger than fiction.
Oh, it is. This is very, very weird.
Yeah, because, you think about that and, say, for instance, if there's a crime committed, how many times have you heard people say, this is something that you wouldn't even think about putting, like a movie or a book or something. It's like, I never even thought that in a million years that scenario over there, that was created. So, and think about it. Thank God that he was incarcerated. After a while, many more victims would have been had, because going through all of that, thankfully he was stalked by being arrested and being incarcerated. And now, when he was, well, not now, but when we were creating the correspondence, instead of like being a hamster on a wheel, just like going and going and going and nothing to show for it. He was like, well, now I have somebody that will listen or read this. He was able to have an outlet. And I think that's one thing that the letters did provide for him, is an outlet to be able to tell some of the things that were, that were in the very inner synapses of his brain, and I can imagine while he was writing it, I could just imagine his brain, all those synapses, that have laid dormant for so long, firing. And that's why he was able to tell all these things, because it was an old hat, for him. Oh, I've told this story 1,000 times, how I feel about, this and that, it was something new. Yeah, and as far as someone reaching out and asking, the right questions, and someone that he felt comfortable enough to convey, knowing that, this is somebody that I can trust, that's not going to run to the officials here at the prison and say, hey, I need you to read this. He knew what, as far as me reaching out to him first, what I was interested in him, which, by the way, when I first started writing him, like we mentioned in the beginning, I had no idea that it was going to encapsulate everything that he put in a letter. I thought it'd be like 1 or 2 pages, and, once every month or two, going back and forth. But yeah, I was very surprised at what I got in return.
He says he savors the memories of these murders, and he wishes other people could know the amazing feeling and sights of what it was like to kill those people.
Yeah, you can definitely tell he was committed. I mean, if he was going to commit to something, as far as if he set his sights on something was definitely going to happen, especially if he knew that, I won't get caught, or as best as I can commit this crime and then be off in the night. He would do it.
Yeah, he goes back and forth. And, when he's writing, you're getting, it's coming out of his brain. And he'll go back and forth between all of the stuff about murder and how much he likes it and all of this, to lots of sexual fantasies, and then murder sex fantasies. And then once in a while, he'll stop and I was fascinated. He explained that, and I know this is a deal that's different in every prison as well, but initially he had a television, and he would get public broadcasting channels. And the only exception was when twice a week they would give them VHS tapes. They would bring a tape in and everybody could watch it. He had really gotten into the OC, which, is just, I can just see this psychotic murderer sitting there watching the OC. Yeah. He liked it. He liked CSI. But then film-wise, I loved his, was it U-Turn? He had just seen a film, I think it was U-Turn, where he was like, they could have done this better. They could definitely have added a lot more violence and sex, whatever. And then he's like, yeah, they finally brought in House of a Thousand Corpses, and it was pretty good, but it just didn't have enough violence and sex. Or then he would just be like, the remake of Texas Chainsaw Massacre is not nearly as good as the first Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Or 28 Days Later, he said, I think it's going to be an instant cult classic. I want to talk about his diagnosis of serial killers, which he calls a serial personality. And he starts that by criticizing, the Hollywood view of serial killers, and that they don't understand that there is a broad spectrum of ways that serial killers may act out, or how their behaviors manifest. Siebert creates a profile of other famous serial killers from his perspective as a serial killer, and it's pretty fascinating. Quoting Siebert, "I would accept the possibility that a few are dominantly inclined as it relates and pertains to their sadomasochistic development, but most, I believe, are inherently submissive because of the extreme degrees of subjugation and humiliation they may have experienced during their developing cycle, sexually and otherwise relevant to the development of psychoses. Personally, I believe this is the most dangerous serial killer and more apt to do more extreme forms of venting, as the inherent dominant aspects of the male's mind erupts in a distorted manner during the venting process. If you can rationalize what I'm saying, or an inherent male mind trapped within the development of a psychosis that subjects it to the reality of allowing oneself to be degraded and humiliated beyond inherent nature, exploding in revolt. Again, if you can rationalize the concept of my thoughts here. He goes on to say, I also think that most, depending on their psycho level prior to their arrests, are bound to necromania and eventually mutilation in various extremes. I have no doubt in my mind that Bundy, Lucas, Toole, Gacy, Shawcross, Coleman, and the majority of others involved themselves in necromania in one fashion or the other. I'm absolutely sure all were voyeurs, and I suspect most involved themselves in degrees of corpse defiling, be it urinating on a victim's dead body or defiling it in other ways available to them. I also suspect, because of most serial personalities linked to gender association as a disorder, that a high percentage involved themselves in degrees of transvestite or cross-dressing behaviors. If you've read any aspects of the case history involving serials, then in the majority of cases, some article of female clothing generally is taken, or something female in general, most often panties, as in my case, but other items as well. This, I believe, in some conscious way, is the serial's attempt to absorb or steal the femininity of the victim, making it his own. He goes on and on. Let me ask you this.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, he's a serial killer, having talked to other killers on death row, corresponded with them, FBI profilers and stuff, talking heads on all these shows. Is he maybe putting a better profile together than they can?
What I believe is, since he has carried out, I think it's shedding new light or more personal insight on the situation. Therefore, I've experienced this, so I believe he has more of an insight of anyone that is just reading it, from a general textbook or, studying it. And yes, of course, anybody that studies it, they're going to have, of course, a more professional view of the situation. But I think we have to give Siebert credit for having experienced it. He's able to provide more insight as far as from his personal opinion about what has been carried on.
It's really, it's the first time I've ever heard a just really sick serial killer diagnose other serial killers. Mm-hmm. It's wild. And at first I just dismissed that. I was like, this is just what happened to him or how he ended up. But then I start looking at some of those, and it's not across the board. Like he said, there's a spectrum of activities for serial personalities, but some of it sounds about right for some of these famous killers we've heard of. Mm-hmm. But it's not always the case.
Exactly. And the far interesting part is shows have been watched and they may interview a serial killer and you get input that way, or they've written a book with the help of somebody. However, having a letter that was personally, written for, myself to give details about it, that took it to a whole new dimension, for me, because it's almost like I'm not getting this through secondhand information. I'm getting it from someone that actually was there during the events, and they carried the various killings, through. It was just, getting their thoughts personally, from it.
I'm just jumping all over the place because there's so much interesting stuff. One of the things he says is he would get contacted quite a bit by a lot of pedophiles and a lot of people into what he calls extreme sadomasochism. He said he talked to a woman in Australia several times who was driven to murderous behaviors because she had been involved or around other murders. A lot of these things are nothing we could verify it or find it, or like as far as a cold case goes, there's just not much there. Whether it's true or not, is this really strange list of alleged communications.
Exactly.
This guy moves fast. He wants to get deeper and deeper really quick. one of the ways he tried to do that was to give you a list of questions to respond to him with. 33 questions. I'm not going to go through all of them. Here are just some of the questions. What are your thoughts on the subject of degradation and humiliation? Have you ever thought of abduction, rape, or enslaving someone, man, woman, or child, to your sexual will? He says, when it comes to my case history and the murderous events in my past, what exactly do you want to know? What are your thoughts on visually witnessing the demise of another human being where sexual deviations are part of the act? Describe a scene briefly where one man is subjecting another to his sadomasochistic lusts. What are your thoughts on torture? Okay, this one's amazing. Most of my victims, those I didn't kill and those I did over the years, were women of all races, prostitutes, and other vulnerable women. What are your thoughts on interracial sexual appetites? Wow.
Yeah. He didn't hold back on anything.
This one isn't for everybody. Strangulation was generally my method of dispatching of a victim. What would you feel if I told you on at least 3 occasions I was inside of a female body during her death? Wow. What are your thoughts regarding the possibility of necrophiling a victim's body? From your perspective, what do you know about the body and how it responds to death, sense, bodily reaction, etc.? What are your thoughts on bondage, body worship, domination and submission, servitude, etc.? What are your thoughts on mutilation, decapitation, disembowelment, dump sites, corpse posturing, and defiling a corpse? What do you have to say about that?
Well, the
Questions.
part I remember when I first got the letter and started reading over the question, I mean, from the very get-go, I thought, how in the world am I going to answer these questions? Because, of course, I mean, thankfully, 1,000% not having any experience on that whatsoever, I had no idea what I was going to say, or I thought, this is a letter that I'm going to have to spend a lot of time thinking and reflecting, because especially I didn't want one question to sound like I was answering the second one, the third one, and give kind of like a cookie cutter answer to all of them. So I had to think in great detail of exactly how I was going to respond to each one, and also to respond to enough detail to keep him interested in the letters, because I didn't want to write something and then if he became bored with it, and then it was a fear of mine that he would lose interest since I could not provide enough detail to what he wanted to feed his craving. I was pretty much at the, in the back of my mind worried that eventually he would just lose interest and stop writing. So I had to make, that was the hardest part, was coming up with something to keep him driven and to give as much what he was providing me to give him what he wanted. Then again, like I said, when I first started writing or looking at the questions, I thought, I have no idea how I'm going to conquer this or tackle these questions.
He says, some victims who were simply an object of my desire and my need to fulfill myself in unusual ways, depending on the instant frame of mind or motivating trigger that may have influenced me to act in one way or another. He always brings it back to this subconscious thing, where it's the act of murder or abduction or something is already playing out before he even realizes that it's happened, because his subconscious darkness took over. And apparently some people were just objects of his desire, and some people were significant victims for reasons he never explains. But he does make a lot of statements like, the nether realms of possibility I have embraced. He's just sitting there wishing that there was a way for him to get out and kill more people and make a splashier show of it, and just he's into it.
Absolutely. And you can imagine with having those desires and being locked away to where you cannot perform them or restart them again, you can imagine how much, that was weighing on him. completely.
Wow. I don't totally understand it, so I'm not going to do a great job of explaining the legalities and what happened at the end of his death row stay and stuff. I'm going to give you a few things and then you tell me where I'm wrong. I don't know how many appeals he had. He was never really involved in his appeals. Like one time he had him file something and it was late, so they didn't consider it. But it came time to die. He filed an emergency motion to stay his execution. But the district judge dismissed it because it was untimely. He had filed it, 3 months too late. So then he took it to the Alabama Supreme Court and they agreed he was going to be executed.
Mm-hmm.
And he was 53 and he had been on death row for 20 years. Then he also filed a federal lawsuit challenging the method of execution in Alabama, which was lethal injection. In papers filed with the Supreme Court, the Attorney General's office asked that they don't delay the execution because of the pending lawsuit. And that lawsuit was based on the theory that lethal injection could cause him severe pain.
Mm-hmm.
That's when he also said that he had preliminary diagnosis that he was suffering from hepatitis C and pancreatic cancer, which could cause complications with the lethal injection procedure. The Middle District and then the state Supreme Court and then finally the big Supreme Court all said no. I don't know if there was another execution date set.
Yeah, as far as I remember, I don't think that there was.
By the way, his original stay came hours before he was going to be executed. It was close.
Mm-hmm.
And we know that, he died of pancreatic cancer, but I can't find anything that tells me if a new execution date was set. So his cancer was racing lethal injection on, which was going to kill him first. So he died in April 2008. What was your correspondence timeline?
If I remember right, I corresponded with him around, I think it had to at least be that long because there was a few hiatuses that occurred, between our writing, which was, more than, a few months. So maybe then we would pick up, writing, where it left off because life carries on through, being on the outside, I had to work and everything. So a lot of times I just didn't have the time because writing Siebert was a full-time commitment. It took many hours of the day to be able to, I guess you would say, feed the appetite, what he was wanting from me. So, sometimes when you get home from work, you really don't want to sit down and comprise, a whole letter, especially dealing with, topics as dark as they were. And it did become that. It became beginning to where it was just like getting, to know his situation and from his perspective. And then after doing it for so long, I had to get into the frame of mind of, okay, I got to broach these subjects and talk about something that I have, like I mentioned earlier, that I have no idea how I'm going to even begin on a subject about, for instance, about posing someone that he had murdered or something along those lines, because of course my mind is completely different from that and it goes in a completely opposite 1000% direction. So it's almost like, how would I be able to correspond with someone that has a fractured mind? It's just something that, like I said, I spent a long time trying to figure out how I was going to answer, the questions that he posed to me. And it was a lot of trial and error of writing something down and thinking, no, he knows fully that, because I know he's intelligent enough to see through things. I didn't want him to think, well, oh, you're writing this from the perspective of, this is what, I want to hear. To where eventually, kind of early on, I pretty much leveled with him and said, hey, I just have to tell you that the questions, while I appreciate you wanting to know my insight or how I would think, my mind just does not work this way. So I have no clue how to answer these. And I remember he took that, without, any questioning or saying, just try harder. You can do this. He never pressured me or anything. In fact, during that one time of telling him that, I think he just dropped it. He never asked anymore. He would come around and elaborate on how he felt about the questions, and he would kind of answer them saying, well, since you're not going to be an active participant in telling me about this, I'm going to kind of think of how I think you may answer or how much I know about you. I was very relieved that I didn't have to worry about having to stop the correspondence, because he just said, well, since you're not going to answer the questions that I pose to you, I'm just going to call it quits. So yeah, he never did that.
We talked a little bit about the death penalty in the last show, and I worry because DNA exonerates people, and I'm terrified that somebody's going to get killed, and then you're going to find out, oh, they put this guy in jail for 25 years and he didn't do anything wrong. But Daniel is an example of someone that undoubtedly, in every way, fingerprints, DNA, witnesses, himself. I mean, he doesn't just confess, like he can prove, we know he did this. He's a crazy guy that wants to abduct, rape, torture, mutilate, kill, and have sex with these people all at the same time. That's kind of what the death penalty is for. I mean, you can't bring these people back, and you can't conceive of what their last moments were like. I mean, it's just awful, and that's his fault. So many states, they either do or don't have the death penalty, and if they do, they've got all different things. Like, we've got the electric chair, we've got lethal injection, and we can put a man on the moon. Can't we make an electric chair that nobody complains about, and everybody's whining about how, I filed these appeals based on lethal injection could hurt. And everybody is like, come on, you deserve however much pain this gives you. But it seems like we could have electric chairs, lethal injection devices that nobody could complain. Just take that right off the table. They're just, the person just gets strapped in and dies, and they never know the difference. Then I think there are still some places you can be hung or shot, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
there are. In fact, I can't recall exactly which state it was in, but the serial killer that I was reading on, that's the way he wanted to meet his death, was, through shooting. And, when I first read that, I thought, do they even do that anymore? And the thing is what was interesting is that there was like six or seven people that were to do the shooting, and only one person held the bullet. So the person who was doing the shooting, you could say, well, I was the one who shot this person. And another thing that they had to deal with as far as execution is, here lately, having the drug available, during its time, when it's time to execute someone. I know there were several occasions that I remember reading to where the drug that's used to carry out the execution, it wasn't available, or it was in short supply, or they were working out maybe the combination of how much to give. And I mean, it was just all these complications that centered around, the drug that did the actual execution.
It's all too complicated. Seems like there would be something that is humane, so you didn't get the complaints about that is not some crazy drug cocktail that's impossible to find, that's not some electrical device that could malfunction. I don't know. It just seems to me like it would make more sense.
Well, let me ask you. In fact, yesterday there was a story about, individuals that want to take their own life, say they're terminally ill. They want to suffer for like 2 or 3 years where their life is just completely, where they're in a vegetative state, or for whatever reason, assisted suicide. That's available. Why not carry out the method that way?
Sure. And I am all for assisted suicide for people suffering with all kinds of things. I mean, it should be your right. Okay. So the big question, we've looked at a lot of this stuff. Seemingly, Daniel had a horrific childhood, had a violent stepfather who raped him and his sister, who he was going through gender identity crisis, and Daniel was running to other men who were also molesting him. He had a kind of a mentor that was kind of teaching him, not quite the killing yet, but serial personality, as Daniel would call it. And then he starts hitchhiking and hustling and doing drugs and hanging out with other street people. It finally kind of all comes out, and we don't really know how many people he killed. We know he committed abductions and rapes that are virtually impossible to pin down where it would have happened really, and who. It would be very difficult to find some of these people, but we don't know. I mean, he admits to a litany of other crimes. In fact, he spent 2 short stints in prison under an assumed name. But then in the end, he commits all of these horrifying acts. At 33, went into prison for multiple murders that he absolutely did, at least that many, and then spends 20 years there. So that was it for Daniel. In the end, what is your take on Daniel Siebert?
One aspect that I would be very curious on is to say, for instance, if his upbringing, if he, had a father that was more nurturing, or a mother that was more nurturing, or where he didn't have to turn to another individual outside the home, for comfort and affection and the love that he sought, which of course he was abused again. To me, as anybody that studies, the criminal mind, they always talk about, for instance, if he was nurtured more, wonder how much in the situation, if he would have ever turned to looking for, the violence or other means to get the love that he craved. Now, of course, it begs also the severity of his cravings. It also stands to reason that he could have had all the love in the world and still would have turned out exactly having the cravings of murder and mayhem, that he demonstrated. But there's always that part of me to wonder how much of it would have, or maybe it wouldn't have happened earlier on in his life. It would have been later. Maybe some of these things might have been manifested. Something I have always wondered about. He was just given, if he was provided more affection, from the very beginning, I just wonder what direction he would have taken.
Yeah, that's a huge question on my mind too. All right, everybody, that's the show. As always, thank you for listening. Get in touch with us at letstalkaboutkillers.com. Follow us on Instagram at Let's Talk About Killers. Be sure to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.